Okay, so take 3. Keep it together, Mark. All you have to do is get the summoner and their Eidolon and all of their tandem abilities and... Man, I feel like I'm just writing a video for 2 entirely separate characters here. Oh no. This is going to be a 2-part video series, isn't it? Today, we're going to begin our discussion of the Summoner class for Pathfinder 2e on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is struggling to escape the shadow of my much more popular and talented imaginary best friend. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to the Classic Introduction series, where we take a look at different classes inside of TTRPGs and ask what opportunities they present for players who might be interested in using that kind of character at the gaming table. So let me just say up front, today's video we're going to be talking about the Summoner for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's one of the new classes that was introduced in the book Secrets of Magic, and this is my 3rd take on trying to get this video correct. So on this series, we've talked about some complex classes, like the Alchemist and the Oracle, and there have certainly been some times where really digging into what a class had to offer took a bit of work. But I'm going to be honest, I wasn't really prepared for just how difficult it was going to be to present the Summoner for this series. And I went through 2 iterations of this video, writing and recording and editing, and just not really being happy with the result until finally I just came to the realization that the Summoner is probably one of those classes that I can't just manage in one video. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Summoner can be considered the premier pet class in Pathfinder 2e. You are a spellcaster that has a magical bond with a creature known as an Eidolon, and you and your bonded monster go on adventures together. It's a pretty interesting concept that plays into a lot of stories that you see in media and other areas of pop culture, and honestly the Summoner is one of the more unique offerings that Paizo has with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so this is a class that I really wanted to do well, and eventually what I realized was that the Summoner and their Eidolon are almost 2 separate characters that you need to understand individually before you can kind of bring that knowledge together to appreciate the class as a whole. So ultimately what I decided to do was re-record Classic Introduction Summoner and split it into 2 parts. This video is part 1, which is talking about the Summoner half of the Summoner class, and then part 2 of this video series will go into the Eidolon, which is the bonded magical monster half of the class, and I'm going to be splitting up the content in these 2 videos so that when we are discussing the Summoner half, we're discussing the portions of the class that are the most relevant to the Spellcaster half of it, and then when we move over to the Eidolon, we'll be taking a look at the portions of the class that are the most directly relevant to that part of the class as well. Now, that being said, I am still going to use the format that I've been using with these videos for a while, in that we're going to examine the Summoner through the lens of 7 specific questions. Number 1, what is the class role of the Summoner? Number 2, how complex is the Summoner? Number 3, what are the key terms and concepts you need to know to play a Summoner? Number 4, what are the Summoner's strengths? Number 5, what are the Summoner's weaknesses? Number 6, what build options does the Summoner give us? And finally, number 7, how can you get the most out of a summoner during play? Now obviously for each of these questions, the answers for the summoner and the Eidolon are going to be a bit different because they represent two different halves of the same whole, so do be aware that this video represents just a portion of the knowledge that you will need to play a summoner, but be on the lookout for part 2 of this video, which, if the editing is not too nightmarish, I'm going to try to have up the same week as this video, but we will see how that plays out. In any case, if you can't tell, this video has taken a lot of work because I really wanted to make sure I got it right for you, so please forgive me for the YouTube stuff, but if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like, share it, subscribe to the channel, check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of that stuff really does go a long way to supporting the channel, and for videos like this where it took a lot of work to get it right, it really does mean a lot to me. And as always, the biggest thing you can do to support this channel is join in the conversation, jump down to the comments section, and give your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions on how to play a summoner. If the summoner class teaches us anything, it's that having a good friend by your side is one of the greatest advantages that you can have, and having the opportunity to get to know you and interact with you is truly one of the best parts of this job, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so the first question that we have in this series is, what is the class role of the summoner? Now, as I've previously mentioned, the summoner can be considered the premier pet class in Pathfinder 2e. There are a number of classes that have some different way of obtaining a pet that can aid you in your adventures. Spellcasters like the Witch and the Wizard can gain a familiar, classes like the Ranger and Druid can get an animal companion, and many different spellcasters can make use of summoning spells to bring different minions to your side, meaning there are a variety of ways for adventurers in Pathfinder to get a creature to aid them on their journey. But the Summoner class is the class that goes all in on the concept of the pet, almost to the point where the pet starts to edge out the Summoner themselves in terms of their actual importance to the overall build. Now, the Summoner class builds around the idea that you have a spellcaster called a Summoner who has bonded with a particular magical creature known as an Eidolon, and they share a magical connection and certain powers as a result of that connection. In general, you can look at the Eidolon as similar to a martial character from another class inside of the game. It's going to function in a role similar to a fighter, a rogue, a barbarian, something to that effect. And then the summoner half of the duo is the support caster that backs up that particular martial character. Now, we're going to talk about the Eidolon more in depth in the next video, so we'll set the Eidolon aside for now, and we're going to look in particular at the summoner themselves, who is, in game terminology, a variable tradition bounded spontaneous spellcaster. Yeah, we're going to talk about that more in the key terms section. Can you guess why it's taken so many takes to get this video right? For now, I think it's best to look through the summoner half of this pair as a support caster. They are primarily there to provide magical backup to the Eidolon through the use of their spellcasting abilities, and then they may have a few other fun tricks that they can bring to bear on top of that. Our second question for this series is, how complex is the summoner? And I'll go ahead and tell you, this is a little bit of a contentious question on the internet. I've read a lot of different opinions about the summoner, and I'll warn you, if you start researching the summoner, you're going to find a wide range of opinions about this class. Some people will tell you the summoner is really hard to build, but really simple to play. Other people will tell you that the summoner is really easy to build and really complex to play. And there is a lot of debate about the specifics of different summoner options that you will find all over the place. So deciding how complex the summoner is, I think can best be summarized by the fact that I had to record this video 3 times to get it right. I'm going to give the summoner an overall complexity rating of 9 out of 10. And part of the reason is because the summoner is just one of those classes where it may not have the same spike in overall complexity or difficulty that you would see with classes like the Alchemist or Oracle, but there's just sort of this consistent level of complexity that you never quite escape there's always going to be some nuance, some detail. There's always going to be a little bit of homework that goes with playing the summoner well. And I do think that you just need to be prepared for that if you're going to play this class. The joke of this video is the summoner class is kind of like playing two different characters at the same time and trying to manage how to get the most out of two different characters at once. Now, I will say this. I have seen at least one brand new Pathfinder 2e player. They had a little bit of TTRPG experience, but they had never played Pathfinder 2e before, who picked up a summoner for a one-shot game and managed it perfectly. So I don't think that the summoner is too much for someone who is really interested in this particular type of character. In fact, as I say with all of my videos, don't let a complexity rating scare you away from a given class. If you really enjoy a concept and you're really invested in that style of character, your excitement and interest is going to outweigh the amount of homework that you need to do. And Summoner is still a class that I think you can get a lot out of. In fact, as we'll talk about later in this video, Summoner is one of those classes that just has a lot of potential variety to it. And while that variety does breed complexity, it also offers a lot of opportunity that can be a ton of fun. So overall, the Summoner is 9 out of 10 on complexity. Be prepared to do some homework, but if you're willing to do some homework and you enjoy this style of character, I do think it's a lot of fun. Okay, so with those two questions out of the way, let's move on to the key terms and concepts that you want to be familiar with if you're going to play a Summoner. By the way, the Summoner can be found starting on page 50 of Secrets of Magic. So that's one of the places you can go to read up about the Summoner more in depth. And during this video, I'm also going to be referencing a lot of the rules from the spellcasting section of the core rulebook, which can be found from pages 296 to pages 306 of the core rulebook. And as with most spellcasting classes in the game, I do strongly recommend taking the time to read through the spellcasting section at least once, so that you're familiar with the basic concepts of that particular aspect of play. Still, when it comes to key terms and concepts, one of the things that Paizo does with every class is they actually give you a convenient sidebar that tells you some of the most important key terms for any class that you might be interested in. And the Summoner gets one of these sidebars. In particular, the Summoner gets 3 key terms that are highlighted, which are Eidolon, Evolution, and Tandem. Now, the Eidolon key term obviously references the Eidolon half of the Summoner class, so that's going to be in the next video. And the Evolution key term also pretty much deals with the Eidolon, so we're going to save those for the next video in this series. But we can go ahead and talk about the key term Tandem, because that is going to be relevant to the Summoner and Eidolon both. Now, I have been saying that the Summoner and the Eidolon can in large part be viewed as 2 separate characters, and in many ways that is true. They have their own stats and skills and options, and the Summoner and Eidolon will each take up a separate space on the battle grid during play. You can look at them as 2 separate characters in many ways, but that's not 100% true. The Summoner and the Eidolon are bonded together, and for that reason they do share certain things. Like, for example, the Summoner and Eidolon have an ability called Share Senses that allows the Summoner to look through the eyes of the Eidolon, or in reverse, allows the Eidolon to look through the eyes of the Summoner. There are certain areas where they overlap. Now, we will deal with some of those areas of overlap, like their hit point pool, in the next video, but one of the big areas of overlap for the Summoner and the Eidolon is in their action pool. Like every other character in Pathfinder 2e, the Summoner at the start of their turn will get 3 actions and 1 reaction that they can use during their round. However, one of the things that sets the Summoner apart from other pet classes like a Ranger or a Druid is the Summoner doesn't have to command their Eidolon. Other classes must spend an action to issue commands that then grants actions to their pet. However, because the Summoner and Eidolon share a bond together, if the Summoner wants the Eidolon to act, they just do. So that pool of 3 actions and 1 reaction becomes a shared pool of actions that the Summoner and Eidolon can kind of freely borrow from with either participant having full access to all of the resources in that pool. Now, this is beneficial in that the summoner isn't issuing commands, but since you have two characters essentially sharing one pool of actions, that could present a potential action tax, which is where tandem abilities come into effect, and the summoner is going to begin with one notable tandem ability known as Act Together. Act Together allows a summoner or their Eidolon to perform a 1, 2, or 3 action activity and give their other half a single action activity that they can use at the exact same time. It doesn't matter what that 1, 2, or 3 action activity is. It could be a strike, it could be a spell, it could be opening a door, it could be any action that you might imagine. But while one member of the team is doing something, the other member of the team gets a single action to do kind of whatever they want without taking anything from that shared pool of actions that I mentioned earlier. And the cool thing about Act Together is it is incredibly flexible. The summoner could be the person who is taking that 2 or 3 action activity and granting the Eidolon a single action, or you could flip the script and the Eidolon could be taking the 1, 2, 3 action activity and granting an action to the summoner. The tandem trait just essentially allows the summoner and the Eidolon to do something at the same time and kind of save on the action cost of 2 characters moving around the battlefield. Now, Act Together is the primary tandem ability that the summoner has access to, but there are other tandem abilities that the summoner can unlock, so just know anytime you see that word tandem, what it's going to do is it's going to allow the summoner or the Eidolon to do something, and then allow the other half to do something at the same time. Each individual example is going to have its own unique rules, but the summoner and the Eidolon know each other so well that they can, effectively, act together and be more effective on the battlefield. Of course, the other big thing we need to talk about for the summoner half of this class is the spellcasting portion, because the summoner is, by and large, where your spellcasting options are going to be concentrated. There are a limited number of ways that an Eidolon can access and use magic, but when we talk about the summoner half of the class, every single summoner is going to be a spellcaster, so you need to understand spellcasting rules to effectively approach the class. When you look at the summoner half of the class, I do think it is best to really consider the summoner a support caster. They are there to support their Eidolon, and then they may have other options on top of the support that they offer. But I think viewing them as a support caster is very important. Still, let's dive into the specifics of how summoner spellcasting works. Earlier I mentioned that the summoner is a variable tradition, bounded, spontaneous spellcaster, and all of those terms have a particular meaning. First up, let's talk about variable tradition. Pathfinder 2e divides all spellcasting into 4 different traditions: Arcane, Divine, Occult, and Primal. And most classes will have one specific spellcasting tradition that they draw from. So wizards are arcane casters and bards are occult casters. That's typically what you see. However, some classes in Pathfinder 2e are variable tradition spellcasters, which means they can potentially have any of the 4 traditions. Now, every summoner will have only one tradition, but their particular tradition of magic is going to be based on the Eidolon or monster that they are bonded to. So, for example, if your summoner is bonded to a dragon Eidolon, you will have access to arcane tradition spells. But if your summoner is bonded to an anger phantom, you'll be using occult tradition spells instead. Essentially, when the summoner picks the monster that they are bonded to, they are also picking the particular spell list that they get to draw their spells from. Next up, we have the word bounded, and I'll go ahead and say that I'm not 100% sure if that's the right terminology. It's just the most frequent terminology that I've seen. The summoner is introduced in Secrets of Magic along with the Magus class, and the summoner and Magus both share a very unique spell progression where they get a very limited number of spell slots. Now, the summoner will get cantrips like any other spellcaster, and summoner cantrips function like normal cantrips for any other class. Cantrips are essentially the same no matter where you go. But when you look at the actual spell slots, That's where the summoner gets different, because the summoner caps out at a maximum of 4 spell slots, which is significantly lower than most of your spellcasting classes. The summoner will begin the game with access to first level spells, and then they'll progress to second level spells, but when the summoner would normally gain access to third level spells, what happens is they lose their first level spell slots, meaning they only have the second and third level spells. This happens again when the summoner would access fourth level spells. They lose access to the second level, leaving only third and fourth level, and so on and so forth throughout the character progression. This effectively means that while the summoner has the same repeated use cantrip spell options that most spellcasters are going to have in the game, when it comes to their higher level, more powerful spell slots, they just aren't going to have very many, and when those 4 spell slots run out, they're gone. So that's what bounded means, but there is a distinction between the summoner's progression and the magus's progression in that the summoner is a spontaneous spellcaster. Pathfinder 2e gives us another division on spellcasters between spontaneous and prepared. Prepared spellcasters get to assign specific spells to spell slots, and then as those spell slots are used up, those spells disappear from their list for that day, but they can switch out the spells that they prepare from day to day. Not so with the spontaneous spellcaster. The spontaneous spellcaster is going to have what's known as a spell repertoire, where they have a certain list of spells that they know, and they can just sort of use any of those spells with an appropriate spell slot, just whenever and however benefits them during the course of the day. What this means practically is that spontaneous spellcasters have a very small list of spells that they know, but more flexibility in how they use those spells during the day. However, this is a little bit of a pain point for the summoner, because that spell repertoire, that list of spells that they know, well, it caps out at 5 spells in your spell repertoire at any given point in time. That is a very small list of spells known. Yes, you have some flexibility in how they're used, but that is a very small, very limited list. There is some good news here. As the summoner levels up, they can switch out the spells that are in their spell repertoire. So, for example, when you gain access to third level spells, it is completely appropriate to ditch some of the first level spells in your spell repertoire to make room for new third level spells. So the summoner is not just going to be hamstrung with the spells that they started the game with, but be aware that your spell repertoire is very limited. However, there is a tiny piece of good news that comes with this in the form of unlimited signature spells. So most spontaneous spellcasting classes have an ability called signature spells, which allows that spellcaster to kind of mix and match the spell that they want to cast with different spell slot levels throughout the course of the day. If it is a signature spell, they don't have to use just one spell slot, but they can use spell slots from any level that they have available as long as it's appropriate to the spell. In game terms, signature spells are sort of free heightening options for spontaneous casters. Well, the summoner treats their entire spell repertoire as signature spells. It's only 5 spells overall that are considered unlimited signature spells, but you don't have to necessarily further micromanage which spells go to which spell slot automatically. But if you take all of these things together, the variable tradition, the bounded spellcasting, the spontaneous spellcasting, the spell repertoire, where every spell in the repertoire is considered a signature spell, wrap all of these things together, and that is the picture of what summoner spellcasting looks like for the most part. However, there are a couple more things that we need to talk about before we leave key terms and concepts, and that is link spells and link cantrips. So, link spells are the summoner's take on focus spells in Pathfinder 2e. Now, we've talked about focus spells for plenty of other classes in this series, and just be aware that when you see link spell for a summoner, that means focus spell. Link spells are going to follow all the normal rules for focus spells in Pathfinder 2e. The summoner is going to begin play with a particular link or focus spell called Evolution Surge that allows you to add temporary abilities to your Eidolon, and the list of options for what those abilities can be are naturally going to grow over the course of your character progression. In addition to link spells, you also have link cantrips. Now, when you see link cantrips, the most important word there is cantrips. They're going to function like normal cantrips, but that designation of link cantrip just means summoner specific. So you can think of link cantrips as summoner specific cantrips that are added to your list of options. Link cantrips do not require the use of a focus point when you cast them, and they can be used like any other cantrip in the game, even though they're not part of your regular cantrip list. Every summoner will begin the game with access to the Boost Eidolon link cantrip, which is a cantrip that allows you to boost the amount of damage that your Eidolon does in combat. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and definitely a handy boost. Now, when it comes to link spells and link cantrips, it is worth noting that you can unlock other options as you level up. Most of the time you're going to get new link spells or link cantrips through particular summoner class feats, and I'll go ahead and tell you, most of the time if you're trying to add to the list of what your summoner can do, that's what your option is going to be. It's going to be a new link spell or link cantrip that you kind of get to add to your repertoire as a summoner. In other words, don't sleep on the link spells and link cantrips, because these are some of the most unique and important options that you as a spellcaster are going to have access to. But now that we've talked about key terms and concepts, let's move on to some of the more entertaining parts of the conversation and ask the question, what are the strengths of the summoner class? Now, one strength that we are largely skipping over here is the Eidolon. That monster that you are bonded to, that is a pretty big strength of the class. Please don't miss that point. We're just talking about that in the next video. But a lot of the benefits of the summoner class are tied up directly or indirectly with the Eidolon. So the fact that the summoner has the best pet action economy in the game through tandem abilities, that's tied to the Eidolon. The fact that the summoner is one of the most durable caster classes in the game, that's tied to the Eidolon. One of the big advantages for the summoner class is just your ability to position yourself around the battlefield and control the battlefield, which boils down to the fact that you are two different characters and you take up multiple spots on the battlefield. A lot of the summoner's strength really does boil down to the fact you have a pet monster that follows you around. But I don't want you to skip out on the fact that your monster has his own support caster following him and helping him with everything he does. The summoner is not just this blank expressionless form that serves to carry around the Eidolon. No, the summoner has things to contribute as well, and that's what I want to talk about here. First and foremost, you are a support caster. You automatically have the ability to boost your Eidolon in terms of its abilities and offensive capabilities, and through other summoner feat selections, you might be able to boost the Eidolon's defense or give it access to other new abilities. There are a lot of things that your magic as a summoner can do to benefit the Eidolon, to say nothing of the other abilities that are going to stack on top of that through your spellcasting. Now, this does vary based on the tradition of magic that you have, but for example, if you are an arcane tradition summoner, you can add artillery support to your Eidolon in the form of a fireball spell. Or if you are a divine tradition summoner, you have access to the versatile and very powerful heal and harm spells. You are a support caster, and as a support caster, you have the ability to bring the most out of your Eidolon, but on top of that, the summoner is also really good at bringing the most out of their team as well. Sure, many of your abilities are themed around making your Eidolon more effective, but as a summoner, you're going to have plenty of options that don't just help your Eidolon, they help your teammates too. And that is a very powerful benefit that you bring to the team. Another thing worth noting is summoners are charisma casters, and if you've watched a few videos in this series, you're probably aware of the fact that charisma casters are notoriously good as the party face. Skills like diplomacy, deception, intimidate, and performance, those are keyed to charisma, and you're naturally going to be pushing charisma high anyways, and that means in social situations, the summoner is almost always going to have something meaningful they can contribute, usually in the form of glaring at people until they give you what you want. Okay, so one thing to go ahead and discuss here is, as a summoner, some of your class skills are going to be tied to the Eidolon that you are bonded to, and every Eidolon is going to give you 2 class skills in particular. The first class skill is always going to be the skill that is keyed to your spellcasting tradition. So if you are an occult spellcaster, they're going to give you occultism. If you're a primal spellcaster, they're going to give you nature. You're always going to get whatever that key skill is, but then your Eidolon will give you a second trained skill, and with only one exception, that second trained skill is always going to be a charisma-based skill of some kind. Now, sometimes it might be diplomacy or deception, but very frequently, the summoner gets intimidation as a trained skill. It's the most common skill available to summoners just based on what Eidolons give you, and I guess it makes sense that you are naturally intimidating if there is a dragon or an undead monstrosity or some other crazy creature staring over your shoulder while you're trying to make people feel about this big. Essentially what I'm saying here is the vast majority of summoners are going to have a strong social game, and a notable subsection of that group of summoners, their social game is often going to be being the scariest person in the room because people don't want you to unleash your companion on them. But what are the weaknesses of the summoner half of the summoner class? Well, this is one of the areas where the strengths of the summoner kind of become the weaknesses as well. Because so much of what you can do is tied up in your Eidolon, that does leave the summoner half of the class, when you look at them by themselves, lacking just a little bit. So, for example, I mentioned that the summoner makes a really good support caster. Well, for weaknesses, as a summoner, you are a really good support caster. Yes, as a summoner, you will have access to some offensive spells. You can choose offensive cantrips. You can choose offensive spells as part of your spell repertoire. You have the ability to bring some fire to bear in a firefight, but relative to a lot of other spellcasters in the game, you're not going to pack that heavy of a spellcasting punch. Most of your spellcasting, especially those link spells and link cantrips we talked about, are focused towards the support role, which means that you are at least partially locked in being a support caster. While there are other things you can do with your spells, you're not going to have the full variety that other spellcasters would have, and in fact, that does highlight one of the weakest parts of the summoner half of this class, which is the summoner has the worst spell versatility of any spellcasting class in this game. Yes, they share bounded spellcasting with the Magus, but the Magus at the very least has a spellbook, and they can switch their spells out each day, allowing them at least some variability day to day in what they can use their magic for. Summoners, you have a spell repertoire, and that spell repertoire is defined. And as a result, your ability to switch out those spells is much more limited than other classes. Essentially, you're going to need to level up or make use of retraining rules if you want to switch something out of your spell repertoire, which is a much bigger investment. Also, I feel like this next weakness is fairly obvious, but is still worth noting. Your Eidolon is this big, beefy monster that can get into melee with opponents and do all kinds of crazy and cool stuff. You're a cloth caster. You are very fragile, and if someone comes after you rather than your Eidolon, that shared pool of hit points that you have with your Eidolon is going to deplete very quickly because you are a lot easier to take down. There is one final weakness that I want to discuss with the summoner, and this is one that I think is easy to overlook if you're not paying attention, and that is the summoner kind of hurts in the skill department. Now, strangely, the summoner does not have the lowest number of trained skills out of the various classes in the game. Classes like the Druid and the Cleric are actually going to be worse. Summoner comes out slightly ahead of them, But the summoner has a unique problem when it comes to their skill selection, in that their skill selection is kind of locked in place. Two of your starting skills are going to be defined by your Eidolon. One of them is a spellcasting skill, and the other one is almost certainly going to be a party face skill of some kind. So don't get me wrong, those options are nice, but as a summoner, intelligence is often going to be your lowest score or second lowest score, meaning you're not going to get a lot of bonus trained skills. And as you are playing a charisma-based caster that is being pushed towards a support role, that means the few remaining trained skills you have available, you are probably going to want to invest those in the other charisma skills or other support skills like medicine or crafting. The summoner is one of those classes where I feel like their skill selection gets locked in place very quickly, and they end up not having some of the flexibility with their skills that other classes in the game might have, even classes like Cleric that theoretically have fewer trained skills. Now, the next question that we cover in this series is what are the build options that are available for the summoner? Now, the major build option choice that you make for the summoner is the particular type of Eidolon that you are bonded to, and obviously the next video where we talk about Eidolons, we're going to spend a lot of time on the different Eidolon options, what they offer, what they represent, and how they affect your build. However, since the summoner is the spellcasting half of the summoner-Eidolon combo, I do want to take a little time and look at some of the spellcasting options that the summoner has, because you do want to know what spellcasting tricks you have to bring to the table through the summoner half of the class. Let's start by talking about the link spells and link cantrips that the summoner has access to. Now, we've already mentioned the summoner is going to begin play with the Evolution Surge focus spell, and the Evolution Surge focus spell, as you level up, it's going to have different options available to it, but basically this is a 2-action spell that is going to allow you to give some sort of temporary boost to your Eidolon. This could be a new sense like Scent or Dark Vision. This could be a new form of movement such as a swim speed, and at higher levels you can even use it to temporarily increase your Eidolon size, but essentially you can spend a focus point to buff your Eidolon in one fashion or another. Boost Eidolon is a link cantrip, so it doesn't require a focus spell, and this is a single action cantrip that will allow you to increase the amount of damage that your Eidolon deals in combat. One of the options is a focus spell called Eidolon's Wrath, which is a 2-action spell that your Eidolon casts, where they basically erupt in energy around them, dealing AoE energy damage to every creature caught in the blast. You can also gain access to another focus spell called Lifelink Surge, which is a single action spell that allows you to give fast healing to your Eidolon for 4 rounds. Another important focus spell that you can potentially access is called Unfetter Eidolon. This takes 2 actions to cast, and for the next minute after you cast it, your Eidolon can travel any distance from you without vanishing from existence. Normally an Eidolon would need to stay within 100 feet, but the Unfetter Eidolon focus spell can allow your bonded monster to travel anywhere and everywhere during that duration. Now, there is one more focus spell that's worth discussing, but I'm going to hold off for just a second because I want to visit the other link cantrip that summoners can cast called Reinforce Eidolon. Now, Boost Eidolon increases the damage that your Eidolon deals. Reinforce Eidolon is the tanking option. This takes a single action to cast and increases your Eidolon's AC and saving throws and gives them damage resistance. And honestly, Reinforce Eidolon pairs really, really well with some of the tankier Eidolons like the Undead Eidolon. But essentially, if Boost Eidolon is the offensive option, Reinforce Eidolon is the defensive option, and it is important to note your Eidolon can only benefit from one or the other at any given time. So, as a summoner, if you pick up Reinforce Eidolon, do be aware that if you choose to use one and then you cast the other, the first will go away. Now back to the focus spells, let's talk about the last focus spell that the summoner can pick up, which is a meta magic focus spell called Extend Boost. Essentially what Extend Boost is going to do is, when you would cast one of your link cantrips, either boost Eidolon or reinforce Eidolon, when you would cast them, you can attempt a skill check to allow one of those cantrips to have a duration greater than one single round. Essentially what this does is it allows you to spend a focus point to attempt to free up some of your action economy. Now there are some skill checks involved here, so your results are going to vary some, but this can be a way to save some actions over progressive rounds during a fight, and that can be a pretty strong benefit. The other thing for spellcasting that you need to be aware of is the actual spellcasting tradition that you get from your Eidolon. Now we don't have space in this video to go into all of the particulars of every spellcasting tradition, but I do want to hit some of the highlights. First up, you have the Arcane Tradition, which is going to be associated with Construct or Dragon Eidolons. In Pathfinder 2e, the Arcane Tradition is built around the Mind and Matter essences, and the Arcane Tradition is, overall, the most versatile spellcasting tradition in the game. It has a wide variety of options. Many of those options make for very effective offensive spells, but you're also going to have some really fun utility spells that are in the mix as well. And a lot of just the really famous spells that we think about in fantasy games can be found inside of the Arcane Tradition. So if you have access to the Arcane Tradition, be prepared to dig through a fun and versatile list of offensive and utility spells that you can use to the benefit of your team. The next tradition is the Divine Tradition, which is going to be associated with the Angel, Demon, Psychopomp, and Undead Eidolons. And in Pathfinder 2e game terms, the Divine Magical Tradition is built from the Spirit and Vital Essences, and I think the easy summary of the Divine Tradition is you can just see the Divine Tradition as the support spellcasting tradition. You're healing your allies, you're calming their fears, you're getting rid of debuffs and dealing with curses. The Divine Tradition is a really great defensive tradition and can really go a long way in keeping your team up, effective, and moving. The next tradition is the Occult Tradition, which is currently only associated with phantoms. In particular, you have the Anger Phantom and the Devotion Phantom. Personally, I think Paizo's probably going to expand these options outside of phantoms in future books, but for now that's what we've got to work with. The Occult Tradition is tied to Mind and Spirit essences inside of Pathfinder 2e, and the quick oversimplification here, you can think of the Occult Tradition as the mind game tradition in spellcasting. Occult Tradition spells are the best at dealing with the mind, at dealing with the spirit. Basically, if it requires a will save, it's probably on the occult list somewhere. So if you see the summoner half of this duo as the sort of person who sits back and messes with the minds of their opponents, the Occult Tradition actually fits that really, really well. The final tradition is the Primal Tradition, which is associated with the Beast, Fae, and Plant Eidolons. Now, in game terms, the Primal Tradition draws from Vital and Matter essences, and I consider the Primal Tradition to be the most physical spellcasting tradition. You have boom spells like Fireball and Chain Lightning, and you have spells that interact with creatures directly, such as Heal and Harm. Basically, the Primal Tradition deals with the world around you in very physical, tangible ways, but as the flip side of the Occult Tradition, struggles to deal with more ephemeral concepts. So if the Occult Tradition is the mind game tradition, the Primal Tradition likes to get physical. Now, before I leave the Primal Tradition, there is one thing I want to note here. The Fae Eidolon is kind of a Primal Tradition plus Eidolon, and the Fae Eidolon kind of blurs the lines between the Primal Tradition and the Arcane Tradition. So do be aware that the Fae Eidolon is going to have a few more options compared to other primal options the summoner can use. Broadly speaking, what you need to know is as a summoner, your spellcasting is going to be a reflection of the Eidolon you have bonded to, and what your summoner can bring to bear is going to be a reflection of the type of magic your Eidolon is associated with. So Arcane and Primal summoners often have some of the better blasting options, while Divine and Occult summoners often have better support and buffing options. Each summoner's particular spellcasting is going to vary, And when you're considering the summoner half of your duo, that is something you want to be aware of and plan for. The last question we're going to talk about today is, how can I get the most out of the summoner in play? A lot of getting the most out of the summoner is going to boil down to how well you manage your Eidolon, so the next video is going to dive into that aspect of the question more in depth, but there are a few things specific to the summoner themselves that I think are worth considering. First, you're squishy. So, the summoner is one of those casters that can fall into a false sense of security. You have a shared hit point pool with your Eidolon, and that hit point pool is, relative to other spellcasters in the game, quite generous. But your Eidolon, that big monster that travels with you, is probably going to be up engaged with other creatures, and that means your Eidolon is probably going to be taking hits from other creatures, so that generous hit point pool that you have been given is not quite as stable as it might first appear. And on top of that, if your opponent gets past your Eidolon to you, you are a squishy cloth caster. Sure, you've got a lot of hit points, but you will probably take some pretty hard hits pretty quickly. What this means is, as a summoner, you want to think very seriously about defense. Anything you can do to improve your Eidolon's defenses, but also your defenses, are going to go a long way to keeping you in the fight and help you avoid those situations where you realize, oh wait, I'm still a caster, I break easy. Now there's a lot of advice here that's going to fall under general gaming stuff. Making sure your dexterity and constitution are high, those are going to be important. Looking for good defensive spells and making sure to position yourself in a way where you are out of the line of fire. All of those things that go into helping you be more defensive are going to be a very important part of play, and as a summoner you just want to make sure you're not forgetting to do that stuff, because this is a class that can get in trouble very quickly if they're not careful. The second thing that I want to say about getting the most out of the summoner is teamwork. I've said several times in this video that the summoner half of this duo, you are a support caster, and I really think if you want to get the most out of the summoner, you need to be prepared to lean into teamwork. It's going to be very, very important for you. The good thing here is, a lot of it's going to be easy to do. First off, your link spells and link cantrips, those are just straight up boons for your Eidolon and make your Eidolon more effective, so that's just free, easy ways to add to your team. But you are a charisma caster, and depending on your tradition, you're going to have a lot of different ways to help your team. Whether it's straight up healing through the divine tradition, or a variety of mind games through the occult tradition, or just some of the best utility casting in the game if you're an arcane caster. As a summoner, you are a support caster, so look for ways to bring that support not just to your Eidolon, but to your team as a whole. Also, don't forget all of those fun charisma skills that we talked about in the party face section. If the game is going to give you Intimidate, lean into Intimidate and debuff the daylights out of your enemies. If you get skills like Deception or Diplomacy instead, you still have plenty of ways to benefit your team and give all of your allies some advantages on the battlefield. And while it's probably not as advisable for you as it is for your Eidolon, it is worth noting flanking is a very beneficial thing in this game, and sending your Eidolon out to ensure that your team is dogpiling the appropriate enemies will go a long way. The last piece of advice I want to talk about is that really limited pool of spells that you have. Basically, anything you can do as a summoner to expand the spells you have access to is going to be a powerful increase to what you can offer your team. For any spellcaster, things like scrolls and wands and especially staves, those are very useful options, but for you as a summoner, because your spell repertoire is so limited, they represent almost an exponential increase in what you can do. A high-level staff can effectively double the size of your spell repertoire. Seriously. And so let me encourage you, look for ways to increase your access to spells, maybe through ancestry feats, maybe through multi-class dedications. Just look for ways to add to the magical tricks that you can perform, and I promise you, you'll get some serious mileage out of that. But with that, we have covered all 7 of the questions that we ask in this series for, well, half of the class that we're talking about. Today we've had a chance to examine the Summoner and what they bring to the table, but the Summoner class is built around that powerful pet called the Eidolon, so in part 2 of the series, we're going to go back and we're going to look at the Eidolon specifically through the lens of these 7 questions to help us understand the other half of what the Summoner brings to the table. So stay tuned, be on the lookout for that video, because ultimately, when you know how to get the most out of the Summoner and their Eidolon together, that's when you're really going to see what this class is capable of and why it's such a fun option that Paizo has presented. But for now, let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Summoner half of the Summoner class in Pathfinder 2e, and do you agree with my analysis? Jump down to the comments section and let me know if there are strengths or weaknesses that I've overlooked, and if you have any particular tips for the Summoner half of the class, be sure to leave those down there as well. Again, anything related to the Eidolon, that's going to be in the next video in this series, so don't worry, that part of the conversation is coming. But I would still love to hear what you have to say about how to make the best use of the Summoner half of this dynamic duo that Paizo gives us. Don't forget all of that other YouTube stuff. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check out my Discord and my Patreon. But until it's time for part 2 of this video to drop, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.